Nice to be reacquainted through this. So I'm a researcher at Stanford University in the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where I study the mental health impacts of the climate crisis and their disproportionate burden on youth. One large phenomenon within that cadre of mental health outcomes is climate anxiety. So today we're going to chat a bit about what climate anxiety is, what impact it has on people, and what can be done about it. So what is it? Pretty obviously, climate anxiety is anxiety about the climate crisis, yes, but it's part of a larger umbrella of widening vocabulary, terms that are popping up to describe people's emotional and affective responses to a quickly changing Earth. So what do I mean by that? People have taken stabs to describe this new dynamic from a variety of perspectives. Here's an interesting one from a group of artists called the Bureau of Linguistical Reality, who call a quintessential emotion of the times broken record breaking, a recurring feeling of deja vu, quiet terror, and slow shock, which is both acute and familiar, that occurs when opening a newspaper, radio program, or website, and reading that year, month, season, day has broken the record for the hottest on record. We're all very familiar with this sinking feeling. Another term is solastalgia, which was coined by a philosopher in Australia named Glenn Albrecht to describe the feeling of barrenness that he experienced when he visited some mountains that he used to play in as a child that had been turned into open tar pit mining, location. And so the solace that he used to find there, the comfort, was gone as a result of the negative environmental change. And so this term really describes the kind of homesickness that we can have when we're still at home after detrimental land transformation has taken place. So it's place-based loss. And these kinds of terms, along with climate anxiety, are really part of this widening vocabulary of psychoterratic emotions. So emotions that are related to perceived and felt states of the earth. Others that you may have heard of are ecological grief, for example, and this describes the grief that people can feel from experiencing in real time or anticipating through a future projection. Ecological losses, they could be species, they could be entire ecosystems, or perhaps cultural traditions that are bound up in a specific place. And this has been theorized by many researchers, but especially headed by Ashley Consolo, who works out in Labrador. She's at Memorial University, but the Inuit communities in Labrador she works with have described a very profound kind of ecological grief as they witness the sea ice, which comprises the main tenet of their identity as people of the ice, literally melting away, right? So being less frozen for less time in the year, which means that they can't go out on the ice and carry out traditional activities, traipsing where ancestors have for thousands of years, hunting, fishing, visiting relatives on the other side of the ice. And increasingly, if they do try to cross the ice at times when it used to be safe to, people can get injured or fall through the ice and disappear. Of course, all of this adds complicated grief on top of the ecological grief. And to fill the time, sometimes people are turning to alcohol and drugs, so maladaptive coping for the feeling of being pent up, for being kind of in this claustrophobic state in the village rather than being able to go out on the ice and live out one's life. So this is really where a lot of the kind of theoretical work, which is now being examined in other quick changing locations due to the climate crisis, has come from. Climate anxiety relates to this bigger term of eco-anxiety, which is very similar to climate anxiety, but just in the sense that it relates to wider registers of environmental concern, biodiversity loss, land transformation, water scarcity, you name it, rather than only the climate crisis per se. But psychologists largely agree that it's more than just anxiety. When eco-anxiety or climate anxiety appears, it co-occurs with a variety of other emotions like the grief that we've been talking about, or fear, dread, despair, helplessness, hopelessness, rage. There's a variety of very commonly occurring challenging ecological emotions that do manifest as what is commonly now called eco-anxiety. but we also know that one's positionality will determine what shape their eco-anxiety has, because for example, while many people from industrialized nations have guilt co-occurring as one of their feelings that makes up the eco-anxiety profile because of living out carbon-intensive lifestyles, many in low and middle income countries who do not live out carbon-intensive lifestyles, of course, do not feel guilty for the climate crisis, and this doesn't make sense within their regimen when it's measured within their populations to feel guilty about what's happening. So, like any kind of anxiety, eco-anxiety or climate anxiety deals with themes of uncertainty and unpredictability and uncontrollability. The fact that this is such an overwhelming crisis and that one cannot navigate very clearly in terms of how to approach the future when there are so many variables at play. Pre-existing anxiety sensitivity can play a role in how it shows up in one person's life, meaning if you have a general anxiety disorder, of course, the climate crisis and other environmental problems will very naturally make you more anxious. However, research has shown time and again that you do not need pre-existing anxiety in order to feel this form of anxiety. Therefore, it is not a pathological mental health disorder. Rather, it's really a rational and reasonable response to an unfolding civilizational threat. It is configured as a type of existential anxiety, so a mental state that's related to being human and wrestling with big fundamental questions in life, like why am I here? What is my purpose? What is the meaning of life, right? And confrontations with mortality. It connects to the sociologist Anthony Giddens' theory of ontological security, which tells us that deep feelings of security or insecurity have really profound consequences for how people act and whether or not they're able to uphold a sense of emotional well-being. You know, the climate and water ecological crisis can make people's very existence and future feel insecure, which is what causes the anxiety and sometimes depression or other defensive reactions. And this can be overwhelming and therefore immobilizing. It can become really problematic if it shuts one down or pushes them into a nihilistic state of believing that no action is meaningful and that it's all done for, that, you know, it's too late, so to speak, which we do see reactions of. But it can also be very practical when it causes a person to gather new information, reassess their lives and make behavior changes, come together with others, push for collective action, and in that sense, manifest itself as a moral emotion, which it also is. So it may come as a surprise to some of you on the call that there is now an emerging field of climate and mental health aware professionals. So climate aware therapists, climate aware psychiatrists, climate aware social workers who are creating a new set of principles to work around to help people with their direct climate trauma, as well as the kind of chronic vicarious trauma that we're talking about here of witnessing and being aware of the climate crisis, such as climate anxiety. And a leading climate aware therapist, Caroline Hickman, has worked with children and young people in countries all over the world. And she's developed a scale of how this kind of anxiety manifests based on that clinical work. So I'll run you through the spectrum because it's not a monolithic thing. It can show up with different levels of the burden and intensity and effect not only on cognition or thinking or emotion and affect, but one's behavior and planning for the future. So when the feelings are mild, it's typical that the person can be, you know, comforted by a focus on reassurance, a focus on optimism, a focus on hope, especially in others' ability to take action and be responsible towards finding solutions, even if those kinds of sentiments are ungrounded. This can quell the eco-anxiety. When the feelings are at a medium level, the person might get upset more frequently. They could feel doubt in others' capacity to take any action. They will start making some changes in their lifestyle, let's say stopping eating meat, stopping flying, that sort of a thing. When the distress gets to a significant level, it is really hard to have any defenses against the anxiety. It becomes more interruptive. It's difficult to mitigate the distress. The person might feel a lot of guilt or shame, depending on, as we already discussed, their positionality in all of this. They might have little faith in others to take action. This can have a really significant impact on relationships. So many therapists are seeing couples come into their clinical rooms where one partner, for example, is gung-ho on having a child and the other does not feel comfortable doing that because of the climate crisis. And of course, that's a very deep fissure and split that requires a lot of emotional processing. And this is from a very significant level of ego anxiety. And when the feelings become severe, this is when real mental health supports are required, because it can deeply affect and disturb one's ability to just get through the day and function. So the person could have intrusive thoughts, their sleep will be affected, they can struggle to get any respite, they could anticipate human extinction, have no ability in other people's care to care, and experience a complete and utter loss of personal security. They might not be able to work anymore or be suicidal. So this is really a wide-ranging phenomenon that we're dealing with that has different requirements of intervention at different levels. So who is most affected? Well, trends show a particular vulnerability for frontline communities, those already exposed to climate hazards, those dealing with environmental injustices. The Yale program on climate communication finds that in the United States, for instance, that Black and Latino groups are more alarmed or concerned about the climate crisis than their white counterparts, and that they're also more willing to move this distress into agency and take action, joining environmental groups, putting their bodies on the line, sort of a thing, than their white counterparts. So we're seeing a line between vulnerability and a connection with the feelings, even if they're not always labeled in the same way. And similarly, in a study that I'll talk about in a moment that I was a part of, where we looked at eco anxiety, climate anxiety in 10,000 children and young people in 10 countries around the world, we found that the impairment to functioning from the climate anxiety was greatest in low and middle income countries that have outsized climate hazard vulnerability and experience with disasters as compared with some of the other high income nations that we looked at. So specifically, the highest disruption to functioning were in places like India, Philippines, Nigeria. Yes. So we also know that self-reporting from those on the professional front lines, such as climate scientists, climate journalists, other forms of scholars, humanities and social scientists, scholars who pay attention to the climate and eco crisis from different lenses, as well as activists, really do bear a huge psychological cost for staring into the abyss of the climate crisis for 8+ hours a day. Often, especially in scientific circles, this demands particular forms of support that they have been lacking for decades because of, well, we can hypothesize, but largely, no norms within the profession to name feelings, but to remain objective, to remain professional, to look at the science from a rational angle and contain one's attention to it within that, while ignoring the kind of affective, emotional elements that could be seen to threaten objectivity, which we're now seeing is leaving many researchers vulnerable to emotional distress and lacking kind of socio-emotional resilience building tools that can be better dealt with when coming together to actually discuss this emotional tool. And there have been studies that look at how activists who also face this kind of psychological burden have better tools for dealing with the emotional aspects of their work than those of the scientists themselves. And we're talking about burnout culture here on top of all of it. So how do we keep people strengthened to stay in this work for the long haul? Trends also unsurprisingly show a particular vulnerability in youth. The globally distributed vulnerable population that has done nothing to really create the crisis yet has inherited it, and the duty to figure out how to find solutions. You'll see this, of course, in the marvelous global student strikes that we've seen since 2018-19 with Greta Thunberg and many others, and the kinds of messages that they put on their placards, as you can see here, as well as growing conversation around reproductive anxiety that many young people are voicing. not feeling like it's a wise thing to put kids into a climate changed world. This breaks down along different kinds of concerns, the two camps being largely that one's worried about the carbon impact of having children, particularly if they're coming from carbon intensive lifestyles, but overwhelmingly it seems to be that the concern from a variety of studies and polls is more so that people are afraid not of what their kids are going to do to the world in terms of their environmental polluting effect, but what the world is going to do to their kids in the decades to come. And there have been activist movements in Canada, the pledge led by Gen Z activists, No Future, No Children, to really spell out the existential stakes of inaction to government leaders saying, if you don't create a safe climate for us, we will refuse to reproduce. And similarly, Birth Strike was an activist movement in the UK that launched in 2019 with similar sentiments. So here is that study I mentioned. So we looked at climate anxiety in 10 countries, 1,000 youth between the ages of 16 to 25 in each country, amounting to 10,000. In Australia, Brazil, Finland, France, India, Nigeria, Philippines, Portugal, the UK, and the US. And we found that 45% of our global respondents reported that climate change negatively affects their daily life and functioning. And so that's a whopping percentage of young people who are saying that on a day-to-day level, it's impacting their ability to eat, concentrate, work, go to school, sleep, spend time in nature, play, have fun, or be in relationships. So basically be easeful young people enjoying their youth. 75% endorse the statement that the future is frightening. More than 50% believe that humanity is doomed, which is a really intense statistic to let land in your heart, just to think about how many young people around the world are carrying that feeling around with them. That they won't have access to the same opportunities that their parents had, and that the things they most value in life will be destroyed. 39% of them said that they're hesitant to have their own kids because of the climate crisis. And importantly, I think the study identified that it's not just that young people are feeling challenged because the environment isn't doing well. It's linked to perceptions of government betrayal and being lied to by leaders who are pretending that they're doing their job to protect young people when their actions are proving otherwise. So a deep sense of being abandoned, or as though the adults have left the building, which produces a big sense of moral injury, is really what the study was starting to sketch out, that further research is now looking into. We're also going back into the data set now in order to understand within a more nuanced, detailed way the differences between each country. Because, for example, in India, nearly 3 in 4 young people said that humanity is doomed. In Brazil, 78% said the government lies. 92% of Filipinos called the future frightening, and so on. So we need to really get at these constructs. Here is some data on the emotions that the young people felt, with the most prevalent ones being that they feel sad, afraid, then anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, guilty, ashamed, despair, hurt, grief, depressed, optimistic, and indifferent. So least of all these do they feel indifferent about the climate crisis. So how to cope? It's not a simple task. We have to find ways of living with a threatening situation that can't be eliminated in the near term, and perhaps can never be completely overcome, and is completely irreconcilable at an individual level, therefore producing those feelings of helplessness and hopelessness that are so tough to bear sometimes. And there are so many ways to deal with this, and I'm just going to identify a few here. So this is by no means comprehensive to what the literature and psychotherapeutic practice and activist practice and everything is saying, but one thing to identify, which can be empowering, especially to a lot of young people, but I think for all of us, is that although the climate crisis really demands a lot of external activism, and as we know, fast yesterday, the urgency is just so enormous. The activism that we need to do is not just external here. We also need to do internal activism, which amounts to emotional processing and psychological exploration in order to build up resilience and socio-emotional endurance for living in dangerous times. And often this is completely disregarded. So just acknowledging that is important. Secondly, as I mentioned, this is nothing to be ashamed of, right? This is not something you're going to find in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that says that there's something wrong with the individual. This is the result of shared social fabric, collective trauma affecting individuals. And so in that way, it can be empowering to understand, as Martin Luther King Jr. has talked about, and Jiddu Krishnamurti, it's no sign of health to be well adapted to a sick society, right? And so we're seeing this play out as our life support systems are starting to deteriorate because of anthropogenic impacts on the environment. Another thing is to see that eco-anxiety might be better understood as eco-compassion, right? It's a sign that you care, it's a sign of one's humanity. It's really something to feel proud of rather than not feel anything at all because we're so defended against even looking at the problem. And of course, this can be practical when it gets people to take up pro-environmental behaviors and collective actions. So in order to get there though, it's very crucial to talk to other people who get it. So as I mentioned with the scientists, a lot of these feelings are disenfranchised. They're not given any room. There's no social norms for talking about this stuff. And it can be very uncomfortable for people to even broach, which makes the sense of suffering much more difficult because people sit in alienation, in isolation. And it's very clear that just connecting with others can take a huge amount of the load off, just to name it, and to be in company of people who will validate the feelings, not say, look out the window, the sky's not falling, you just got an anxiety disorder, you're being dramatic, cheer up, but really mirror the concerns, give them permission and say, okay, yeah, like let's talk about how messy this is and how challenging this is, and then we'll figure out ways through together. So that's what the process of containment can give. Containment is that safe space or container in which to do that talking. And because of the growth of these kinds of difficult psychotraumatic emotions in recent years, especially in the last two, there are now a variety of places to specifically go to know that you're going to get that safe containing space. So there are one-on-one drop-in sessions, for example, like Climate Awakening, a virtual series that people can join from anywhere in the world to have that kind of company, or climate cafes, which are decentralized gatherings in that kind of friendly cafe format where people can be frank about what they're feeling. The Climate Psychology Alliance of North America and the United Kingdom organize ongoing ones that you can attend virtually as well. But if you just Google ones close to your location, sometimes, people in your community are running them already. And then there's things that are not so one-off, but they're more programmatic. They have a sequence to them called emotional methodologies, which are really designed to move people through environmental distress towards investing that emotional energy into actions that matter. So some to mention here are the Good Grief Network, for example, who have actually created a program that people have run in more than a dozen countries around the world. And it's a 10-step program modeled on Alcoholics Anonymous. And so it really, each week has a theme. For example, like the first step is accept the severity of the predicament. Second is know that I am part of the problem and part of the solution. There's other things in there about confronting mortality. There's things about doing inner work. And then by the end, people are called to find a purpose to attach their emotions to as a way of reworking the energy, which has produced a lot of proactive environmental change for people doing the program. There's also the work that reconnects, for example, using grief as a way to see the world with new eyes on the other side of a difficult tunnel of emotional processing around climate, run by Joanna Macy, systems thinker, Buddhist teacher, anti-nuclear activist since the 70s that many people are doing in pockets around the world. And the All We Can Save project has circles doing a similar thing. And then there's climate aware therapy, which I mentioned. So you can find these climate aware mental health professionals now offering therapy for climate-related distress through things like the Climate Psychology Alliances, the Climate Psychiatry Alliance, another group called Psychologists for a Safe Future. Many of these therapists do offer free introductory sessions. And so going to their websites, you can actually find directories of where you can find these kinds of mental health professionals for people who are in need. Another thing, and I'm just checking the time here, let me know if I'm going too long. It's important to become aware of one's own anxiety sensor. This is, for young people who are feeling this as much as anyone else. That, for me, when I'm anxious, for example, I can't sleep. That's when I know when things are not really in balance. But for others, it might be a clenching in the jaw, or overeating, or not eating enough, or so on and so forth. So having that awareness, and then being able to understand this concept of the window of tolerance, right? That our body gives us signals when we are outside of this window in which life feels like smooth sailing. This is a concept by the psychiatrist Dan Siegel, which basically says when we are too stressed and hypervigilant, we get pushed out of that window. We become emotionally distressed, and we are overreactive. We don't have clear thinking ability anymore, because we actually, our nervous system reacts in such a way that we then have this impact on losing contact with the prefrontal cortex, which is the most recently evolved part of our brain that we need for executive functioning. So higher order cognitions, the ability to make decisions based on morality, for example, or judge the future based on the present, be compassionate. And when that gets knocked offline, we have more of the lizard brain capabilities of vigilance and survival mode, and therefore we can't problem solve and be our best selves. But similarly, we can get pushed out of the window of tolerance if we're not aroused enough, if we're numb, if we're depressed, if we're hypoactive and detached and unmotivated. So being aware of these kinds of patterns in our lives is important, because the window of tolerance can move, we can stretch it. There's things we can help ourselves and others practice, like mindfulness, grounding work, breath work, meditation, intentionally spending time in nature so that it lowers our cortisol stress hormone levels, which is called forest bathing or Shinrin-yoku. Other forms of self-care that you'll know work for you, whether that's cooking, playing music, doing yoga, being with your kids, whatever. And I think it's evident just how helpful this is with climate events, because now here in California, where I am, Californian firefighters are integrating yoga and meditation into their daily work when fire season hits, because of the difficult stress that they're dealing with the unprecedented forest fires that are blazing each year. And
Britt,
so,
sorry, Britt, we're at the time for this session, but if you could, I'll just get you to wrap up your last few slides so we can hopefully sneak in a question or two before we go to the next.
Yeah, great. I'm wrapping up now. So basically, when we develop these kinds of awarenesses and skills for helping our nervous systems interiorly, but also helping each other in a deeper kind of emotional and cognitive sense by working with rather than against the emotions, it can really become a kind of super fuel for clarity and taking various kind of mixed actions that can help at this time. So really, lastly, ecological and grief and anxiety, though some might want to ward off this response, can really be the start of a healthy way of engaging with climate change. As some researchers write in The Lancet, recognizing that emotions are often what leads people to act, it is possible that feelings of ecological anxiety and grief, although uncomfortable, are in fact the crucible through which humanity must pass to harness the energy and conviction that are needed for the life-saving changes now required. Okay, that's it for me. I have a newsletter on these topics that's free if you'd like to sign up at Jen Dredd there, the URL, and a book coming out on these topics in May. Thank you for your attention, and I'd love to take a question if there's time.
Yeah, I think we'll make our next piece of the agenda would be the break. So I think we can take a couple minutes here. We'll make it up later. I think that was very, very engrossing, and I was almost about to shed a tear there. Depressing, but also hopeful at the end. You offer some great solutions and tips. So if anyone has a question, you can use the raised hand feature. Vous pouvez lever la main avec la fonction Zoom, or write it in the chat ou écrire votre question dans la boîte de dialogue. Sometimes you need to let that sit, but allez-y.
Sorry for going long.
So, yeah, René, vas-y.
Wonderful presentation. Yeah, makes tear coming. So what can you say to a young adult who doesn't want to have children because of climate change, because what the climate will do to them in the future?
Well, I've dealt with this question personally for many years. It's actually the impetus that got me paying attention to the psychological impacts of the climate crisis, because I found it to be such a difficult dilemma myself to answer around this. And, you know, I've learned, of course, that there is no right or wrong way of answering this question. It is incredibly personal. It is tied up with all kinds of very complex factors that are going to vary for each and every one. But I think it's very important that that person discuss it, find ways of connecting with others over it, having many ways of reflect on this question. There is an activist movement called Conceivable Future that hosts gatherings for people to talk about how the climate crisis is playing into their family planning, and they do not prescribe a way of doing. They say you can have 10 kids, you can have a vasectomy out of your fear of the climate crisis, whatever it is, you know, we welcome your approach. And that kind of honesty, that kind of real emotional dwelling with the question has been very helpful. But ultimately, it's a tough thing because you cannot have half a child. It is a binary decision at some point. And you can also, of course, explore alternative family structures, and adoption is a huge topic in this area as well. So very cheesy, but I have so much more to say about this. I write about it a lot in my book. I have a chapter called Baby Doomers in my book that takes a multi-pronged look at the question. So perhaps share that with whoever's wondering. Thanks.
We have I'll take one. I think we should take one last question. As a question with Laurence has her hand up, and if you can just keep the answer to a minute or two, and then we'll go off on our break. Donc Laurence.
Hi. Yeah, thanks so much for the awesome presentation. Yeah, so I'm doing my master's right now, and I'm looking at the intersection of people's eco-anxiety and how alternative practices is a way to act on that anxiety. I'm just wondering if you see different types of emotions being more prone to like generative actions. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. So this has been studied, and it is, at least according to one study, found that eco-anger, anger and rage, tapping into the injustice of this, is a more motivating emotion to work from than eco-depression, eco-anxiety, so to speak. But by no means is the verdict out on that. It's early days for really being able to measure and track the processes that mediate different reactions. That's kind of like the golden ball that everyone's trying to figure out right now. That doesn't make sense, but you know what I mean? That's the golden nugget is, what can be done to make these emotions proactive and veer people on that collective action taking path, as opposed to nihilism, fatalism, doubt in others' actions to make any difference. And we don't know, but we do know from, many people self-reporting in that one study that anger and rage, and really understanding the history of fossil fuel industry, like manipulation and political corruption, and the injustice of tying to colonialism, and who's most vulnerable now to environmental traumas, all of that can be incredibly motivating.
Thanks so much, Britt. That was amazing. I would have like 20 questions I wouldn't want to ask you if I had you one-on-one. Maybe we'll have the honor of having you back. Yeah, maybe we can get you back at some point, but thanks so much for sharing all your knowledge.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
Nice to see you.
So